The assembly floor of the Bell aircraft factory in Buffalo was roaring with machinery when the wrench in one mechanic's hand suddenly stopped mid-turn. A test pilot's voice echoed across the hangar, sharp enough to cut through the clatter of tools. "I'm not flying that death trap." It was March 1942, and his refusal wasn't the first. It was the fifth that week. Under the fluorescent lights, the new Bell P-39 Airacobra gleamed like a machine born ahead of its time. The paint was still fresh on its unusual mid-engine fuselage. The tricycle landing gear stood proudly, and the massive 37mm cannon in its nose hinted at devastating firepower. But to the men asked to strap into it, this wasn't innovation, it was a coffin with wings. The timing could not have been worse. America needed fighters desperately after Pearl Harbor. Factories were running nonstop, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, trying to produce anything that could take to the sky. Yet here was a sleek new fighter that pilots actively avoided. British test crews had cancelled their order. French units collapsed before ever receiving theirs. And American pilots studied the specifications only to request transfers to literally anything else. Even Bell's own test pilots, the men paid to risk their lives in unproven machines, were starting to refuse the cockpit. Outsiders didn't see the problem. From a distance, the P-39 looked modern, deadly, even elegant. But hidden beneath the metal skin was a system that behaved more like a violent experiment than a precision aircraft. Bell's design, at least on paper, was brilliant. By placing the Allison engine behind the pilot, they created ideal weight balance and freed the entire nose for weapons. A long drive shaft ran under the pilot's feet, connecting the rear engine to the front propeller through an intricate series of gears. It was an engineering marvel, until it wasn't. In flight, that same drive shaft produced brutal vibrations that shook the entire fuselage. Pilots described the experience as sitting on a runaway washing machine. Worse, any mechanical failure behind the pilot meant debris, smoke, and flames could surge straight into the cockpit. Problems that were normally visible in front of you now erupted at your back, often with no warning. The men building it didn't know it yet, but the P-39 story was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. A twist that would carry this failed fighter halfway around the world into the deadliest skies on Earth. The P-39's worst flaw revealed itself the moment pilots tried to climb. The Allison V-1710 engine, perfectly strong at low level, choked and lost power above 12,000 feet. This wasn't a minor annoyance. It made the aircraft nearly useless in the role it had been built for. At a time when enemy bombers attacked from high altitude and fighters hunted from even higher, the Airacobra simply couldn't reach the fight. German Bf-109s routinely patrolled at 25,000 feet. Japanese Zeros were comfortable at similar heights. A P-39 pilot trying to intercept them was like a man trying to run up a mountain while someone else sprinted downhill straight at him. Altitude was life in aerial combat, and the Airacobra couldn't get enough of it. Colonel Bruce Holloway, tasked with evaluating the P-39 in early 1942, filed a report that spread quietly through Army Air Forces headquarters like a death sentence. He wrote that the fighter was fundamentally unsuited for interception, had a dangerous climb above 10,000 feet, and lacked the ceiling required for its intended mission. Coming from a respected commander, this wasn't criticism, it was a burial. Under normal circumstances, that report alone would have shut the entire project down. But 1942 was anything but normal. America was scrambling to rebuild its military. Aircraft production lines had just been established. Skilled workers were still being trained. Canceling the P-39 meant shutting down a massive factory, retooling everything, and losing months during the most desperate phase of the war. So the factories kept building a fighter that nobody wanted. Hundreds rolled off the production lines with nowhere to go. They were parked in long, dusty rows at storage fields across the country. Wings shimmering, tires sinking into the ground, and not a single frontline unit willing to claim them. An entire war machine was producing orphans. Behind closed doors, American officials discussed an uncomfortable truth. The United States had accidentally mass-produced a fighter that its own pilots considered a liability. No commander wanted to explain to Congress why so much material was being wasted. No factory wanted to stop production. And no pilot wanted to risk his life in a machine he didn't trust. They needed a solution, a place to send the Airacobra where failure wouldn't come back to haunt them. That solution arrived from the last place anyone expected. A nation fighting for its very survival, willing to take anything that could fly. The breakthrough came from a front soaked in blood and desperation. The Soviet Union, reeling under the weight of the German invasion, needed aircraft of any kind, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, even training machines. Stalin delivered a message through diplomatic channels that was as blunt as it was urgent. Send everything you can. Immediately. For American officials, this was the perfect opportunity disguised as alliance support. If the Soviets were willing to accept anything with wings, then the unwanted P-39s finally had a destination. The plan was simple. Send the Airacobras through Lend-Lease, fulfill obligations to Moscow, and quietly dispose of an embarrassment without grounding American pilots in a risky machine. The journey the Airacobras took to reach battle was almost as dangerous as combat itself. Crated P-39s were loaded onto ships on the U.S. East Coast, sailed through U-boat-infested waters into the Persian Gulf, then transported across Iran by rail and truck. From there, Soviet crews reassembled them and ferried them north to the front lines. A process that seemed insane, but it worked. Many aircraft never made the journey. German submarines torpedoed Lend-Lease cargo ships. Crates were damaged in handling. Some Airacobras arrived dented, scorched, or missing components. But by late 1942, the first operational P-39s began arriving at Soviet bases, and instead of skepticism, they were met with curiosity and cautious optimism. Unlike American pilots, Soviet aviators had no preconceived hatred for the aircraft. They didn't need high-altitude interceptors. Their war was fought low, fast, and brutally close to the ground. Dive bombers, strafing attacks, ambushes at treetop height. This was their reality. And at those altitudes, the Airacobra's biggest weakness simply vanished. To pilots who had spent the early war flying fragile, underarmed aircraft like the Lag-3, the P-39 felt like stepping into another century. It was sturdy. It had firepower unmatched by anything in their inventory. And most importantly, it could take hits and keep flying, a fact Soviet pilots valued more than speed or altitude. One of the first official assessments came from Senior Lieutenant Grigori Rechkalov. After flying early missions in the Airacobra, he wrote that the aircraft dives like thunder and called the 37mm cannon a gift from heaven. His enthusiasm wasn't poetic, it was practical. A few shells from that massive gun could rip a German bomber in half. This was only the beginning. The Soviets didn't just accept the Airacobra, they studied it, adapted to it, and soon began using it in ways American designers never imagined. As Soviet pilots gained more flight hours in the Airacobra, something remarkable happened. They stopped treating it like a foreign machine and began shaping it into a weapon built for their style of warfare. They didn't approach it with the bureaucratic caution of Western evaluators. They pushed it, stressed it, risked it, and learned exactly where it excelled. The Eastern Front was a battlefield where altitude was a luxury no one had. German Stuka dive bombers attacked at treetop height. Soviet fighters chased them barely above the ground. Tanks, artillery, infantry, everything was close. In this chaotic, brutal environment, the P-39 was not just adequate. It was perfectly adapted. The Airacobra's supposedly heavy handling turned into an advantage. Its weight made it stable in high-speed dives. Its concentrated nose-mounted armament meant accuracy increased the closer it got. And its rugged construction allowed it to absorb punishment that would have shredded the lightweight Soviet and German designs. As the aircraft proved itself, Soviet tactical manuals began evolving around it. Instead of the complex energy-fighting doctrines practiced by Western pilots, Soviet squadrons adopted a simple, aggressive philosophy: hit hard, hit fast, don't hesitate. The Airacobra rewarded boldness. Every pilot who flew it quickly realized that hesitation was the only real danger. One early adopter, Lieutenant Rechkalov, described a moment that became famous among pilots. In one mission, he fired 3 37mm shells into a Junkers Ju-88. The bomber's tail section separated cleanly from the fuselage. The crew never had time to respond. To the Soviets, this was proof. The Airacobra didn't just shoot down enemy aircraft, it erased them from the sky. These early successes created a tidal wave of confidence. Squadrons that once relied on wooden, underpowered fighters now had a machine capable of punching holes through German bombers, shredding Stukas, and surviving hits that should have killed the pilot. The Airacobra became more than a fighter. It became a symbol that the Soviets could turn American cast-offs into instruments of destruction. But the Airacobra's true transformation was still ahead. One man, a pilot with a fierce mind and a revolutionary approach to air combat, would unlock the aircraft's full potential and change the entire course of Soviet air tactics. The transformation of the P-39 reached its peak when one man took the controls, a pilot whose intensity, instincts, and tactical genius would reshape the Eastern Front air war. His name was Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin, a sharp-eyed Siberian with a reputation for flying like he was negotiating with death itself. Before the Airacobra, he'd been forced to fight in outdated aircraft that barely kept up with German fighters. With the P-39, everything changed. From the moment he sat in the cockpit, Pokryshkin sensed potential others had missed. The mid-engine layout didn't intimidate him, he felt its balance. The heavy cannon didn't bother him, he saw opportunity. While others saw instability, he sensed raw, untamed power. And he was determined to bend it into a weapon tailored to his exact fighting style. Pokryshkin began analyzing every quirk of the Airacobra. He tested how hard it could dive before compressibility set in. He studied how much speed it gained in a vertical drop. He experimented with firing distances, learning that the 37mm cannon was most effective terrifyingly close, almost point-blank. Soon he was not just flying the aircraft, he was decoding it. What emerged was his famous formula for air combat. It wasn't a traditional manual, it was a philosophy. Altitude is your bank account. Speed is your currency. Surprise is your weapon. Instead of tight dogfighting turns, Pokryshkin emphasized controlled aggression. Approach from above, strike with terrifying precision, and climb out before the enemy even understands what happened. Under Pokryshkin's leadership, Soviet squadrons flying Airacobras adopted this new doctrine with religious devotion. They patrolled at medium altitude, watching for German formations below. When they spotted a target, they didn't maneuver into long, swirling dogfights. They dropped like hammers. A dive, a flash of cannon fire, and a clean exit. The Germans never expected American-built aircraft to attack with such ferocity. Pokryshkin's victories began to pile up at a staggering pace. 5, 10, 20, 30. German pilots soon recognized the danger. His radio call sign, Satka, meaning 100, became a whispered warning, Achtung, Satka in der Luft. Attention, the 100 is in the air. When his presence was reported, German formations often broke apart before the fight even began. But Pokryshkin's greatest test, and the Airacobra's ultimate proving ground, was still ahead. A battle unlike anything the world had seen was coming, and the Airacobra would play a starring role. In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front braced for a confrontation so immense that even Soviet commanders struggled to describe it. The Germans were preparing their final all-or-nothing offensive in the east, Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of troops, and wave after wave of aircraft converged on a single region. For the Soviets, holding the line meant survival. For the Germans, breaking through meant regaining the initiative. Into the storm flew Pokryshkin and the P-39 Airacobras of the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment. While American pilots had abandoned the aircraft as a failure, the Soviets were about to unleash it on the largest armored attack in history. German commanders expected to seize air superiority early, a routine advantage they relied on. Instead, they encountered squadrons of Airacobras flying with precision and aggression they had never seen before. The first days of the battle were chaos in the sky. Luftwaffe FW-190s and Bf-109s dove into the battlefield to protect massive columns of German armor. But they didn't have the skies to themselves. P-39s swooped down from medium altitude, attacking with textbook execution of Pokryshkin's formula. Surprise, speed, and a devastating burst of cannon fire. In 1 week, Pokryshkin's regiment claimed over 100 German aircraft destroyed. His own personal tally skyrocketed. He positioned his Airacobras where the Luftwaffe least expected to see them, diving into Stuka formations, shredding ground attack aircraft, and ambushing German fighters as they climbed from low-level runs. The 37mm cannon turned every attack into a lethal, decisive strike. The Luftwaffe was stunned. The aircraft they had dismissed as an American reject was now tearing through their formations. Reports from German units described the same nightmare repeatedly. Airacobras appearing from nowhere, firing a single burst, and disappearing into the clouds before a counterattack could form. Pokryshkin's pilots were not dogfighting, they were executing surgical strikes. By mid-July, the Germans had lost the ability to dominate the air over Kursk. Their armored thrust stalled. Their ground forces were repeatedly exposed to Soviet attacks. And for the first time in the war, German troops on the Eastern Front faced an enemy that not only matched their air power, but in key moments surpassed it. The Airacobra had gone from disgrace to decisive. But Kursk was just one chapter. The real shock came afterward, when American intelligence realized what the Soviets had achieved with the aircraft the U.S. had written off. By late 1943, stories from the Eastern Front began reaching American intelligence officers, stories that made no sense to anyone who had flown the Airacobra. Soviet squadrons were reportedly scoring massive kill counts. Entire German formations were being broken apart by P-39s. Pokryshkin and his regiment were becoming legends. At first, U.S. analysts dismissed the reports as exaggeration or Soviet morale propaganda. But the evidence kept building. Supply officers noted something strange. Soviet commanders were requesting more P-39s specifically, even when offered newer American fighters like the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. Why would they ask for a failed design when better options existed? That question bothered Washington more than they admitted publicly. Then came combat footage. Grainy, shaky, filmed from Soviet gun cameras, but unmistakable. Airacobras shredding German Stukas, diving through clouds, firing devastating short bursts, pulling out with such stability that analysts replayed the footage repeatedly, trying to understand how the aircraft they'd rejected could behave so precisely. Doubt turned into confusion. Confusion turned into uneasy respect. The final blow to American skepticism came when they studied kill tallies. Pokryshkin was not just excelling. He was becoming one of the highest-scoring Allied aces of the entire war. And he was doing it exclusively in the P-39. Soon analysts discovered that many top Soviet aces, Rechkalov, Glinka, and others, had made the Airacobra their signature aircraft. The flying coffin was producing elite killers. American engineers reluctantly revisited the P-39's design files. They realized something uncomfortable. The aircraft wasn't inherently bad. It had simply been built for the wrong war. The U.S. needed high-altitude escort fighters. The Soviets needed low-altitude hunters. Same machine, two completely different battlegrounds. It was a lesson in context that no committee had considered back in 1941. And so, quietly, the P-39 went from an American embarrassment to an American curiosity. Officers who once mocked it now studied it. Designers who dismissed it now reconsidered its bold choices. The mid-engine layout, the tricycle landing gear, the nose-mounted cannon. Something unexpected was happening. The Airacobra was no longer a failure. It was a blueprint for future innovation. But the story didn't end with respect. It evolved into inspiration. The failures of the P-39 would directly shape the next generation of American fighters, including the first true U.S. jet. While the Soviets were turning the Airacobra into a frontline predator, Bell aircraft engineers back in the United States were learning from its bruising reputation. The P-39 had exposed hard truths about engine performance, supercharging, and airframe vibration. Its problems were painful, but they forced American designers to confront weaknesses they had long overlooked. In a strange twist, every flaw became a lesson. One of the biggest takeaways was the mid-engine concept. Though the P-39's execution created vibration issues, the layout itself offered unmatched balance and cockpit visibility. Future designers realized that putting the engine behind the pilot wasn't a mistake. It was an idea ahead of its time. When jet propulsion arrived, mid-engine designs would become not only practical but essential. Another innovation, the tricycle landing gear, was initially mocked by pilots who preferred traditional taildragger designs. Yet it proved far superior. Safer landings, better visibility, fewer ground accidents. By 1944, nearly every American aircraft designer adopted the tricycle gear as standard. What began as a controversial gamble became a defining feature of modern aviation. Then there was the weapon layout. The P-39 mounted all its guns in the nose. No wing flex, no dispersion, no complicated harmonization issues. The Airacobra's 37mm cannon had taught American engineers a simple truth. Centralized firepower was devastatingly effective. Jet fighters like the P-80 and F-86 would follow this exact philosophy, placing their guns where accuracy was guaranteed. When Clarence Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, one of America's greatest aircraft designers, began work on the P-80 Shooting Star, he unknowingly followed a trail the P-39 had helped clear. A sleek nose, tricycle gear, emphasis on visibility, mid-engine configuration. The resemblance wasn't coincidence. It was evolution. The P-80 became America's first operational jet fighter, and its design bore the fingerprints of lessons learned from the Airacobra's struggles. Perhaps the most surprising legacy of the P-39 was philosophical. American designers realized that an aircraft's success depended not just on performance metrics, but on where and how it was used. A fighter could be a disaster in one environment and a masterpiece in another. This shift in thinking reshaped U.S. aviation doctrine for decades, influencing everything from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. But the story wasn't finished yet. The Airacobra's Soviet legacy reached heights no American engineer ever imagined, creating aces who rivaled the best in the world. By 1944, the Airacobra had become the backbone of several elite Soviet fighter regiments. What began as a desperate stopgap turned into one of the most successful chapters in Eastern Front aviation. And at the center of this transformation were the men who mastered the machine, pilots who turned the P-39 into a precision instrument of destruction. Alexander Pokryshkin wasn't alone. His regiment produced multiple aces whose scores rivaled and often surpassed Western pilots. Grigori Rechkalov, one of the USSR's top scorers, executed more than 50 confirmed victories, many of them achieved in the cockpit of an Airacobra. His aggressive, low-altitude attacks became the model for younger pilots entering the fray. Then there was Dmitry Glinka, a natural tactician with hawk-like situational awareness. Glinka used the Airacobra's stability in high-speed dives to devastating effect, striking German aircraft before they realized they were being hunted. His ability to strike and vanish made him feared among Luftwaffe bomber crews. Soviet squadrons developed a reputation that unnerved German pilots. They did not fight fair, and they did not waste time. Airacobras appeared low over forests, skimmed the treetops, and then surged upward in sudden ambushes. At these altitudes, their firepower was unmatched. When a 37mm round hit home, it didn't cripple, it obliterated. On the ground, Soviet mechanics became experts in coaxing every last drop of performance from the Airacobra's Allison engine. They modified fuel mixtures, adjusted superchargers, and learned the aircraft's quirks as intimately as the pilots. For every ace in the sky, there were mechanics on the ground treating each fighter as a living creature that needed attention and understanding. By the war's end, the numbers spoke for themselves. Of the top 10 highest-scoring Soviet aces, the majority achieved their victories in American-built P-39s. Pokryshkin finished with 59 confirmed kills, becoming the second highest-scoring Allied ace of World War II. Ivan Kozadub, who flew a different aircraft, surpassed him, but Pokryshkin remained the undisputed master of the Airacobra. Yet even this astonishing combat success was only part of the Airacobra's fate. What happened after the war, and how its legacy reshaped aviation long after it vanished from service, is the final twist in its remarkable journey. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the P-39 Airacobra stood at a strange crossroads. In the West, most pilots remembered it as a misfit, a machine with good intentions and bad execution. In the East, it was a hero, a frontline slayer that had helped carve open the path to Berlin. This split identity followed the aircraft into the post-war years, shaping a legacy unlike any other World War II fighter. As the Soviet Union transitioned to jets, the P-39 was quietly phased out. The same thing happened in the United States. where the arrival of the P-80 Shooting Star and later the F-86 Sabre made piston fighters feel ancient overnight. Most Airacobras were scrapped, melted down, or cannibalized for parts. Very few survived, and fewer still were preserved as museum pieces. Yet even in silence, the P-39 still echoed through aviation history. Designers across America had taken its lessons to heart. The importance of visibility, the value of stability under fire, the advantages of centralized weapon placement, the promise and pitfalls of a mid-engine configuration. These ideas didn't die with the P-39. They migrated into jet fighters that would dominate the skies for decades. The irony was impossible to ignore. The failure fighter had quietly fathered many of America's jet-age victories. Without the P-39's shortcomings, America might not have pursued the superchargers and high-altitude engineering that powered the P-51. Without its innovations, mid-engine layouts and tricycle landing gear might not have become standard practice. The Airacobra never dominated its own war, but it shaped the ones that followed. And what of the pilots and workers who built it? In Buffalo, factory crews who once overheard test pilots condemning the aircraft never knew what their creation achieved thousands of miles away. They had no idea their unwanted fighter was helping the Soviets win dogfights above Kursk and Stalingrad. Their hands had built a legend, but history seldom told them. Today, the few surviving P-39s sit quietly in museums, overshadowed by Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires. Visitors glance at them, read a plaque, and walk on, unaware they're looking at one of the most misunderstood machines of World War II. A fighter that failed where it was expected to win, and triumphed where no one imagined it could. The Airacobra's story is a reminder that history is rarely neat. Sometimes the greatest innovations are buried in the failures. Sometimes the rejected, the underestimated, and the misunderstood become the foundation for future greatness. And sometimes the machine written off as a flying coffin becomes the very aircraft that teaches a nation how to master the sky. The P-39 was never the star America wanted, but it became the hero the Soviets needed, and the teacher American engineers didn't know they relied upon. Its legacy lives not in fame, but in the wings of every jet fighter that came after.